intently, finding it overdramatic, far too overdramatic for my taste. So I recommend the kind of rolling over in bed, flicking it open, bleary-eyed, and persuading your husband to get you a cup of tea version of having a go at reading it. But Martin and I struggle a little bit with consistency. I feel like I've used up all my consistency staying married for as long as we have. And despite the nagging and the help of the app, it took us about 2 years to complete the Bible in a year. So, be encouraged, those of you who maybe come and go with what you're doing. So despite being a Christian for about 30 years, this was actually the first time I'd read the Bible cover to cover in one go. I'm pretty sure that I've read most of it in between, some of it lots, but not the whole thing in one go. And I experienced some of the issues that Tony was talking about at the start of this year's reading scheme. Sometimes I genuinely found it boring, particularly the bits about heights of columns and how many decorative pomegranates you should put where. We had a kind of a bit of a ongoing joke about, it's another chapter about pomegranates. So we found those a bit tedious, genuinely. Now, I'm also pretty sure that if I had a better understanding of the importance of those passages for the people it was written for, I'd have got more from my reading. Which brings me to one of the other points. I found some bits hard to understand, really, really hard to understand. And short of opting for a biblical history course or extensive research that I just genuinely don't have time for, and that even a biblical scholar, I think, could spend a lifetime dealing with, I was a bit stuck, really, on finding some of it just a bit difficult. And the other thing that suggested, that I think someone from the congregation, possibly Ian, said was that reading the Bible could be challenging to us. Now, I found this to be very true, but possibly not in the way that we're suggesting. Yes, there are bits that are challenging to our behaviour, challenging to how we work out our faith, challenging in the way that we want to make our lives fall in line with God's will for our lives. Yes, absolutely, completely, and I was challenged in that way. But reading the Bible in this way actually challenged my very beliefs and my faith. I found myself wanting to gain a greater understanding of what I had read because I was challenged by it. I found it really difficult. So that Martin and I decided that once we'd finished reading the Bible, which we did just before Christmas, we would read some other books together to try and help us gain some more understanding about what the story was really all about. I'm saying this as someone who's been a Christian for 30 years. I found it challenging reading the whole Bible, and I need to know more. So Tony suggested, I think, that when we find things challenging, we should go to those with more wisdom than ourselves. We should seek help from somewhere. I like reading, so I'm reading books. I have exactly no biblical training, so please feel free to take absolutely everything I have to say with a big pinch of salt. This is just my observations, things that have struck me, and bits of reading that I have done around this topic. So one of the things I've been reading about is how Jesus might have read the Bible. What would the traditions at the time have been? What would the traditions have looked like? And whatever else, I just don't think it would have looked like this. So here's some suggestions that Rob Bell made about how Jesus might have read the Bible. On the Sabbath.
Sorry. I switched that one off. That was a bit foolish. On the Sabbath day, you'll go to the synagogue in your village, and the Hazan, the worship leader, would take the Torah scroll out of the ark and parade it through the congregation, inviting everyone to dance in honour of the Torah. The scroll would be opened, and someone would read that day's Torah portion, and then there would have been commentary and discussion about what it means and how you live it. And everybody joined in. It was assumed you had an opinion, and it was assumed that you had questions. Of course you had questions. Questions were a sign of life, a sign this mattered to you, a sign you were engaged with the text. The Bible in Jesus' world was a scroll that you saw and heard someone reading in the centre of the room, in the midst of the community, and then you all discussed it. You surrounded the words, you encircled them literally, physically, and then you engaged with them together. It was a communal experience. Picture all that energy swirling around the room. Picture all those opinions. Picture really wise people saying interesting and profound things. Picture that crazy uncle rambling on and making no sense. And then you come back the next week and do it all over again. The Torah started the discussion.
As an aside from my notes, I like the thing about the questions, that questions are really important. I was listening to Radio 2 this morning, and Reverend Kate Botley was saying people sometimes think that when you've got faith, you've got it sorted, you've got your questions answered, and her opinion was that actually having faith often throws up even more questions, and I think she's right. So our faith grows and changes. My faith has grown and changed over time. Our relationship and understanding of God changes over time. Our questions vary as society changes over time. We have to examine the Bible afresh, anew, in a new light as our faith grows, as society changes. And our faith shouldn't be a static thing. It can grow in many ways, but key is that our understanding and learning should inform our behaviour, what we do. Our orthodoxy, our understanding of the truth, should inform our orthopraxy, the way we practice that understanding of the truth. Here's a little bit more from Rob Bell.
The Torah started the discussion. For many in our world, the Bible ends the discussion. Someone stands up and reads from the Bible and then tells the gathered masses what it means and what is right and how it should be interpreted, and then the service is over and everybody leaves. But in the first century world of Jesus, the Torah, the prophets, and the wisdom writings were the start of the discussion. You read it together, and then you interpreted it. You engaged with it. You turned the gem. This wasn't just an intellectual exercise. This was about life. How do you live? What do you do? How do you act? How do you treat people? How do you conduct yourself? Think whatever you want, let your mind wander, but how you act, that's what matters. They saw the Torah then as an expression of love, as the ultimate union between heaven and earth, between the divine and the human. Jesus' tribe understood these books as both particular to their tribe, written by their people, and yet worldwide and universal, the divine words for everybody, everywhere, for all of creation. And it had to be interpreted. You read it, your people read it, and then you made decisions about how to live it out. You made decisions about what it means to love your neighbour, decisions about how to honour and respect life. You made decisions about how exactly you keep one day holy. You made decisions about how to best care for the poor, and on it goes. You lived with the assumption that there was always something new to learn, always something new to discuss, always something new to talk about, because life never stops bringing you events and circumstances that demand you ask, what is the best thing to do here?
So it's no good just growing in understanding if that doesn't make us grow in love and demonstration of our love for God and others. But how we do it and what it means to do it are things that are easily up for discussion. So let's move on to the chapters that are for the Bible reading for this coming week, and they are Hebrews 1 to 6. So just thinking about why Hebrews was written, well, no one really knows who it was written by or who it was written to. It's not like one of those books in the Bible that starts, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God to the saints at Ephesus, the faithful of Christ Jesus, grace and peace to you from God our Father with the Lord Jesus Christ, which sets out immediately who it's to and who it's from, and it's got a nice introductory set of greetings too. This book gets straight to it. It seems to be aimed primarily at the Jewish audience, and the reason we can think that is because it engages with the scriptures that they've heard at the synagogue on a regular basis. It references back to the Old Testament more than 80 times. It kind of reads much more formally than some of the other books that we've been reading, and it's a book comparing the Jewish faith with this new development that's happened. A sort of commentary on the Old Testament. It seems like a book that is relating what's already known by the people in the Jewish scriptures and then showing how Jesus fits into this. Specifically, Jesus as the Son fits into this. this probably made it really accessible for its original audience, but it's probably one of the things that makes it slightly less accessible, perhaps, to us, where we don't have that lived-in Jewish experience. And we maybe don't have that knowledge of the Old Testament in the same way. So it's important to read it in the context of who it was originally probably written for, and for what purpose, because then things may become a little clearer to us, and we can start to make sense of how they can still have meaning to us today. I'm not able to give you in-depth scholarship, just a few of my personal reflections, things that have struck me as I've read through these chapters a few times this week, and things that I have read about them. And hopefully you'll be able to poke and prod about yourself in these passages and see what comes up for yourselves. So I'm going to run through a few key points for each chapter and then one focus area. Okay, so the main thrust of the chapters seems to be about Jesus as the Son of God and how he compares to figures in the Old Testament, which the Bible audience would have been very, very familiar with. He's compared to the angels, he's compared to Abraham, he's compared to Moses, and he's compared to some other priests. So if we take it by chapter, in chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, we can see that Jesus is showing how God has now, it's showing how Jesus is now how God has spoken to the world. In many ways and by many means, God spoke in ancient times to our ancestors through the prophets. But at the end of these days, he spoke to us in a Son. He appointed this Son to be the heir of all things. Through him, in addition, he created the world. This seems to tie in with the start of John's Gospel, that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and he was with God in the beginning, and through him all things were made. And it's also a passage that sets the Son in the sweep of history, a fulfillment of all that biblical commentary coming through beforehand, the biblical history. And in this chapter, as we move on, he's compared to the angels. He's said to be higher than the angels and worshipped by the angels. The Son is the light of God's glory and the imprint of God's being. He maintains everything with his powerful message. After he carried out the cleansing of people from their sins, he sat down at the right side of the highest majesty. And the Son became so much greater than the other messengers, such as the angels. And he received a more important title than theirs. But then, when he brought his firstborn into the world, he said, all of God's angels must worship him. The permanent and everlasting nature of God is also suggested in this section, and the joyfulness and the lovingness and the important position of Jesus sitting at that right hand. I love this next bit. It's just got such a poetic feel to it. It just is a lovely piece of prose. About the Son, he says, your throne, O God, will last forever and ever. A scepter of justice will be the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has set you above your companions by anointing you with the oil of joy. He also says, in the beginning, Lord, you laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you will remain. They will all wear out like a garment. You will roll them up like a robe. Like a garment, they'll be changed, but you remain the same, and your years will never end. Just as an aside, a scepter was a sign of authority and power, an important stick. And the Jewish people would have probably been used to the Romans being the people who were wielding that authority in quite a negative way. So a scepter of righteousness seems to be implying that this is going to be a different sort of rule for eternity than the earthly one that they'd been experiencing. If we move into chapter 2, we see the thing that calls to me in this section is that Jesus talks to us as his brothers, and I'm sure sisters as well, and that he helps us, and he can help us because of his understanding of what it is to suffer. And then if we move into chapter 3, this brings us back to descriptions of Jesus and comparisons, this time with Moses, who is told he's more worthy than. So in chapter 3, verses 1 to 3, it says, fix your thoughts on Jesus, whom we acknowledge as our apostle and high priest. He was faithful to the one who appointed him, just as Moses was faithful in all of God's house. Jesus had been found worthy of greater honor than Moses, just as the builder of a house has greater honor than the house himself. I'm looking for Paul and his house building. He's disappeared, hasn't he? So I'm sure that Paul feels that he's worthy of more honor than the actual house for building his house himself. In this chapter, we get the start of a repeating theme as well. We shouldn't harden our hearts. We hear God speaking to us, and we shouldn't harden our hearts. And then we also get some more referencing back to the Old Testament. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, as you did in the rebellion, during the time of testing in the wilderness, where your ancestors tested and tried me. As we move into chapter 4, the focus moves on now to not merely hearing from God, but once we have heard, letting that enable us to have faith and to enter into God's rest. Tony's made mention of God's rest on the notes, and there are lots of things you can read about that. I'm going to let you Google that for yourself if you want more information on the variety of God's rest that might be implied in this passage. But more importantly for me, we get further exhortations not to harden our hearts. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your heart. And in this chapter, we start to get references to the Son as the great high priest, which is expanded upon as we move into chapter 5 and into chapter 6. In chapter 5 it says, "In this way God qualified him as a perfect high priest. He became the source of eternal salvation for all those who obey him. And God designated him to be a high priest in the order of Melchizedek." Okay, I'm going to say that name a lot. I've probably spelled it wrong. You know, if it annoys you, please just wipe it out. I did listen on Google this morning to how to pronounce it. So, this is a section that I want to stop at for the rest of the sermon. The idea of the Son as the perfect high priest, and that God designated him a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. So, what does it mean to be a high priest? In my head, I'd kind of guessed it was like being Archbishop of Canterbury, or maybe the Pope. You're probably in charge of all the other priests, and there's probably a lot of admin. But during my reading for this, it turns out that I was missing the plot, really, and that a high priest, the key job of a high priest, was interceding between man and God, between his people and God. And that Jesus is described as the perfect high priest, completely able to intercede between us and God because of his unique and mysterious position as being human and suffering as a human, and yet being God. In the Jewish tradition, the high priest would have formed the liturgical and ceremonial bridge between the people and God, and Jesus does this in perfection and complete sympathy with our human weakness and frailty. So then what about this obscure reference to Melchizedek? So there are many, many names in the Bible. Many tribes, many people, many nations, and I find it difficult to keep track of them. As I was reading through the Bible, I did think I should have kind of tried to make a timeline myself with different names and people, because I was definitely confused. So without a lot of context, it can be quite difficult, and I often just gloss over that. So God designated him to be a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. Okay, so that Melchizedek thing, that's some sort of priestly thing. Let's just ignore it and keep going. So I've read this passage numerous times, and I had never even noticed this word until I was reading through this Rob Bell book, What is the Bible, a few weeks ago, and he brought it out in a chapter. So that's why it stood out to me again when I was reading it through for this sermon. So it is funny, though, how we can read something over and over again and just not notice it. And this Melchizedek is only mentioned twice, other than in Hebrews, in the Psalms, and a tiny, tiny bit in the book of Genesis. So let's look at that bit in the book of Genesis. So this is the story of God's people. And after a battle, Abraham meets Melchizedek out of nowhere in the King's Valley. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abraham, saying, Blessed be Abraham of God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise be to the Most High God, who delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. There's a few unusual things here. Firstly, Melchizedek is described as a priest of God Most High. But he was not part of Abraham's tribe. He was not a Jew, he was a Gentile. But he's described as a priest of God Most High, and he gives a blessing to Abraham, who is the one in Genesis that God uses to bless all the other nations. It's all back to front. It's not the way we would expect things to be. It's interesting to think about the fact here that it's Abraham being blessed by someone outside of his faith tradition, and he honoured him by giving him a tithe. I think it's worth bearing in mind Abraham's response when we hear good and insightful things and when we are blessed by people from outside our own preferred denomination or worldview or even faith. Here was someone who was outside of the main story who already was on board with God. He was on board with God and God's story, and it's an indication to us of the bigger picture that God had for the whole world beyond Abraham's tribe. So firstly, we have this unusual high priest thing. Secondly, Melchizedek was a king as well as a priest. In some translations, it says that he's a king of righteousness. And this is another clue to his outsider status, because the Israelites would not have had a king and a priest. You wouldn't have been both of those things. They came from different parts of the family. So the Levite branch of the family were the priests, and the kingly parts were from Judah's branch of the family. Yep, they weren't one and the same. So again, this is something that is unusual and actually feeds in nicely to where we're going in Hebrews. These are key when Jesus is said to be a high priest in the order of Melchizedek, because he was a high priest from outside the usual conventions, and he can operate as both our king and our high priest. So as we think about Jesus as our king and high priest, we come back to some really, really wonderful words in Hebrews. Hebrews 4, verses 14 to 16. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who's unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. So one of the ways we can approach God in our time of need is through taking communion together. We do this together as a church, declaring our need of mercy and forgiveness, declaring our weaknesses and our desire to come closer to God, to lead lives that become more aligned with God. So as we prepare to take communion together, I'm going to read those words from Hebrews again,